All right, Shinsia, I'm going to address your next question, but your next question reads, in his 4 voyages to the Americas between 1492 and 1502, Columbus has been accused of enslaving the natives, poor administration, exploitation, and of having brought illness and violence to the indigenous peoples. How do you respond to these charges? So I just want to point out that you tell me your editor is limiting you to 4,000 some words, and yet you send me half a dozen questions, and one of them is 5 questions in one. So, I mean, it's just unrealistic. And I don't know how you're going to get around this, but I'm leaving that to you, because I'm going to give you a thorough answer. And you can either tell your editor to shove his word limit where the sun don't shine, or you could give, you can do a lot of work to abbreviate this in a way that faithfully captures historical truth. So I'm just going to have to do this in separate videos because I can't do all 5 in one video. It's just too much information. So I'm going to start with enslaving the natives. So first of all, they're not natives and they're not indigenous peoples, okay? They were the first colonizers, okay? They crossed over into the continents, into the land masses that became the continents of North and South America over ice bridges that had formed during the Ice Age and that were still in existence at the time of their migration. So they then spread out through North America and Central America and South America, or what we now call North, Central, and South America, and they colonized those lands. So they were the first colonizers. And the Canadians call them the First Nations, which I think is probably a better way of referring to them than calling them indigenous or natives, okay? I call them the tribal peoples because that's what they call themselves. They have their tribal councils, tribal this, tribal that. All right, so now that that's out of the way, I'm going to start with, let's talk about the allegations with respect to enslaving, the allegations that Columbus was a slave owner, all right? So that's quick and easy. Christopher Columbus never, ever owned slaves. Not one. Not any. He was a genuine. Okay, in his time and in his social class, the low-born son of a weaver, slavery just wasn't practiced. His people learned trades and became tradesmen. He apprenticed to mariners and he became a sailor. He never owned a slave. Even when he married a noblewoman, Doña Felipa Perestrella, he didn't have any slaves. She was of Italian descent but lived in Portugal, and he and Felipa moved to the island of Porto Santo, where the following year their son Diego was born. But Felipa died in childbirth, and the proof that Columbus had no slaves was that he had to stop sailing to raise his son. He was a single father, and an impoverished one at that. Columbus was bankrupted by having to provide a funeral for his wife befitting a noblewoman. He couldn't even have afforded a slave. And when little Diego was 4 years old, finally old enough to get around fairly capably alongside his father, Columbus took him along to continental Europe, where together they pounded the proverbial pavements for nearly a decade, trying to convince kings and princes to fund Columbus's crazy idea that he could sail across the Atlantic and find the Indies. If Columbus had owned a slave, he wouldn't have had to take Diego with him, or he would have had to take the slave with him. But that's not what happened. And even when he set sail on his first voyage, he had no slaves, only sailors. When he landed in the West Indies and went around meeting the Tainos, he never enslaved any of them. He made friends of them, especially with the Taino chieftain Guacanagari of Hispaniola. And he worked very hard at persuading the king and queen of Spain not to enslave the tribal peoples. In his journal entry of October 14th, 1492, Columbus spends the entire first paragraph emphasizing to the monarchs the friendliness of the Tainos, whom he had just met, to dissuade the crown from waging war on them. You see, under the feudal repartimiento, any jihadists conquered or captured by Spain as a result of their reconquista, or reconquering of Spain from the Moors, was by law to be a slave. Columbus didn't want this to happen to the Tainos, so he didn't want the warmongering Spanish monarchs to consider them belligerents. Rather, he emphasized his assessment of the Tainos as gentle friends and not foes to be conquered. He told the crown the Tainos are, quote, very unskilled in arms, and he said, quote, I see no necessity to build a fort. or to expend the labor to build a defensive skerry, even though to do so would take only, quote, 2 days. He made a point to say all this to reassure the monarchs that the Taínos would not seek to wage war on Spain. Now, Columbus was canny. He knew Ferdinand and Isabella well. He had dealt with them for 8 years, trying to persuade them to fund his voyage. He knew that they had been more concerned with the Reconquista, and as such, they had the taste of blood after their victories driving the Moors from Granada and elsewhere. He feared greatly that as the monarchs were imposing the repartimiento on the reconquered jihadists, that they might, in their bloodlust, blindly enforce it against the Taínos as well. So he used a clever rhetorical technique so as not to give the monarchs the impression that he was telling them what to do. He wrote to them, quote, "However, should your highnesses command it, all of the inhabitants could be taken away to Castile or held as slaves on the island, for with 50 men we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we wish." Now, this often quoted line from Columbus's journal employs a clever trick. Notice how he says, with 50 men. Not with 50 soldiers, but 50 men. He already had double that number of men with him in his crew at the time he was writing this. In other words, he's convincing the crown not to send men-at-arms, soldiers, or conquistadors, because with half the number of men he already had with him, he could quell any military threat to the Taínos that the Taínos could pose, I should say. And it worked. As long as Columbus was governor of the West Indies, the Taínos were never treated as conquered people. And they were never enslaved under the repartimiento or under any other authority. And when the recalcitrant hidalgos, the Spanish nobles, Spanish land barons, who really looked down upon Columbus for being, number one, a foreigner, a Genoan, and number two, not noble born. He was the son of weavers, as I said. When the hidalgos took slaves against his wishes, he found a legal loophole. He ferried the enslaved Taínos back to Spain on his third underground railroad to have them liberated by the crown and the church. Now, I told you about the first two underground railroads in a previous video. Now this is the third one. And when he could no longer do that, he successfully petitioned the King of Spain to issue a royal decree, the first civil rights legislation of the Americas. And it read as follows, quote, "All the Indians of Hispaniola are to be left free, not subject to servitude, unmolested and unharmed, and allowed to live like freemen under law, just like any other in the kingdom of Castile." End quote. That's what it said. How about that? Columbus drafted that. And the King Ferdinand, now widowed, he adopted that wholesale. You see, that oft-quoted line from Columbus's journal also had another semantic trick in it. The verb subjugar. Okay, so while it can be translated to mean to subjugate, it also means to make subjects of. Well, let's not forget, definitions change of words, and in this case, it had both definitions in the Middle Ages, because in the Middle Ages, that was the paradigm. It was the medieval lord and subject paradigm. All right, so when Columbus uses the verb subjugar, he's really saying to make subjects of, as in to make Spanish citizens of the Taínos, with all the rights and protections that citizenship entailed, including protection from any other nation's attempt at conquest, enslavement, displacement, or any other act of aggression. Columbus knew others would be coming from other countries in his wake, and he sought to protect the Taínos from them. Now, it's Columbus's consistent actions that show how he was tricking the monarchs out of enslaving the Taínos. And this is why I can't give you an answer in under 4,000 words, because Columbus is using rhetorical tricks here, and the way we know that is because the wording is clever and they're belied by his actions. That Columbus wouldn't even let his sailors take Taínos aboard his ships against the Taínos' will, much less enslave them. On October 15th, 1492, a Taíno canoeman paddled up to the ships seeking to barter a ball of cotton. The canoeman refused to come aboard, so some sailors seized him. But Columbus freed the Taíno canoeman and even gave him some gifts for his trouble, some clothing, some jewelry, some hawk's bells. Columbus wrote afterward, quote, "He appeared astonished. It seemed to him that we were good people," end quote. And the man went on to give, quote, "such a good account of Columbus and his crew that, quote, the canoes swarmed around the ship all that night," end quote. Now, Columbus used that same clever semantic trick again in his letter of February the 15th, 1493, to the court of Spain. In that letter, he assured the crown that the Taínos are not the, quote, monsters which many people expected, end quote, but rather very good people. Still, knowing his place and using subtle diplomacy, really semantic trickery, Columbus assured the crown that, quote, he will bring them as many slaves as they ask, taken from the idolaters. Now notice, first of all, he says, as they ask, as in, he won't do it otherwise. But the real important part is that last phrase, taken from the idolaters. See, despite coming into contact with a great many idolaters among the Taínos, including those who worshipped little wooden idols they called semies, the worship of which involved snorting powdered drugs through hollow reeds, and a chieftain's servant, that's right, I said servant, the Taínos practiced slavery, hiding and speaking to the worshippers through a tube to convince them that the idol was speaking. This is all told in chapter 62 of Hernando Colón's Life of the Admiral. Columbus still wrote to the crown, quote, I have not been able to discover any idolatry or other religious belief among them, end quote. So, to save even the idolaters that he knew existed from slavery, Columbus reported to the crown that he found no idolaters, even when he had. He cleverly and subtly created a loophole in his promise to prevent the enslavement of any of the tribal peoples. In that same letter, Columbus instead exhorted the crown to give the Taínos, quote, the love and service of their highnesses and the whole Spanish nation, end quote. Columbus repeatedly urged the Catholic monarchs of Spain to grant the Taínos the protection from slavery that baptism afforded, including, but not limited to, his logbook entries of October 11th and October 16th of 1492, his February 15th, 1493 letters to Comptroller General of the House of Aragon, Luis de San Angel, and who was also the High Treasurer to, there was a different letter to a different High Treasurer of Aragon, Gabriel Sanchez. So both of those letters of February 15, 1493, and both of those entries from his 1492 logbook entries. So Columbus and the Catholic monarchs were concerned about the Taínos' salvation, and they wanted them baptized. But the important part here is baptized people could not be enslaved in Christendom. In fact, Columbus was greatly concerned, even upon first meeting the Taínos on his first landfall of his first voyage, when he saw their bodies covered in wounds and scars, which they told him were from a tribe of savage, cannibalistic marauders who descended on their islands in enormous war parties and attacked them once a year. These were the Caribs and the Cannibs. And Columbus figured, though, that they were the subjects of the Great Khan of China, who were capturing and enslaving the Taínos, and he wanted to keep the Taínos safe from being enslaved by the Chinese. Later on, he found out it wasn't the Chinese, it was this Carib tribe, or this Cannib tribe. Now, Columbus's oft-quoted observation in his logbook entry of October 13th, 1492, where he says, quote, they should be fine servants, end quote. That's a mistranslation. Deber, which is translated to be should. They should be fine servants, deber. It also means must. They must be fine servants of whomever they serve in the feudal paradigm. He figured it was the Great Khan of China. But even if you translate it as should, Columbus's use of the word servant didn't mean slave. Everyone served someone in the feudal paradigm. So Columbus himself was a servant of the crown. And this is proven by the fact that in the same passage, he exhorted the crown, for whom he was writing these log entries, to baptize the Taínos, because baptized people could not be enslaved in Christendom. Moreover, he feared that the denizens of the Indies and subjects of the Great Khan, quote, came from the mainland to capture them for slaves, end quote, though the reality of the Caribs was far more grisly. This is Columbus's first pledge to protect the Taínos, not the least of which to protect them from enslavement. Now note the double standard Columbus is subjected to here. When Harriet Tubman pledged to author and abolish, when she pledged to author and abolitionist Edna Dow Cheney in 1865 that she would, quote, fight for the freedom of slaves, Harriet Tubman is hailed as a heroine, and murals and statues of her are erected. But when Christopher Columbus pledges to protect the Taínos from enslavement by the Great Khan and later by the Spanish Hidalgos, and then actually does so, he is called all manner of slanderous names and his statues are torn down and everything. When two drunk college students toppled a statue to abolitionist Frederick Douglass in Rochester, New York in 2018, the first hues and cries were of, quote, allegations of racism, according to a USA Today article about the crime. But when Philadelphia's Christopher Columbus statues are desecrated on the same day that Philadelphia's History of Italian Immigration Museum is vandalized, the only sound heard is crickets, few as they are in the city. If it weren't for double standards, the Columbus detractors would have no standards at all. Now, the Columbus detractors like to point out that Columbus signed an agreement with his alcalde, roughly translated as a mayor, but it's not exactly a mayor. You know, these are feudal governmental positions. They don't match entirely with modern political positions. It's more like a mix of a judge and a mayor by modern standards. But when they like to point out that he signed an agreement with his alcalde, Francisco Roldan, allowing the Hidalgos to take slaves. But what they don't tell you is that Roldan and his Hidalgo conspirators rose up in an armed rebellion against Columbus over his slavery prohibition. And they forced him, at proverbial sword point, to sign the agreement. But Columbus got the last laugh. Though he signed it under duress, he subsequently sailed back to Spain, taking the enslaved Taínos with him on this third Underground Railroad to be liberated by the crown and the church. Columbus didn't concede to Roldan. He outwitted him. Now, the Columbus detractors also like to say that Columbus advocated transporting natives to Spain as quote-unquote laborers, Taínos and Caribs and Siboney and other tribal peoples. But he wasn't advocating slavery. See, Columbus kept taking willing Taínos back to Spain from his first two voyages, on return from the first voyage as emissaries of their chieftain to the crown, and on return from his second voyage to be liberated from enslavement by the disobedient Hidalgos, the Spanish landed nobles. But once these Taínos got to Spain, particularly those Columbus was liberating from slavery, the crown didn't know what to do with them. They couldn't send them back because the Hidalgos would enslave them again or torture or kill them. But the Taínos didn't have the life skills to exist in the urban world of 15th, 16th century Castile. So Columbus advocated teaching the Taínos skills, like he had, weaving, sailing, translating, whatever, so that they could live productive, free lives in Spain, or at least as free as any human being could be in the medieval paradigm. Now, I mentioned that that was Columbus's third Underground Railroad. If you don't remember from my previous videos with the first two, where Columbus's first Underground Railroad was his taking Jews on board the ships of his first voyage to help them escape persecution by the Spanish Inquisition, which started the same year as his first voyage. And Columbus's second Underground Railroad occurred at the very beginning of his second voyage to the New World with a specific mission: to find the islands of the Caribs as vaguely described to him by all the Tainos he'd met on his first voyage, and liberate the Tainos that the Caribs had enslaved. And he did it without any maps or charts of the Caribbean and nothing to go on but the vague, barely consistent accounts that the Tainos had told him about marauding tribes from the northwest. And Christopher Columbus sailed directly from Spain to the Carib strongholds on that voyage. Dr. Diego Chanca, one of the surgeons of Columbus's second fleet of 16 ships, actually really it was 17 ships, because I guess you got to count the flagship as well as part of the fleet. I said 16 in previous videos because I'm thinking the flagship and then a fleet of 16, but really I guess if you include the flagship, which you should, it was a fleet of 17 ships. And Dr. Diego Chanca was one of the surgeons in this fleet of 17 ships, and he wrote in his epistolary account of the second voyage, quote, "By the goodness of God and thanks to the admiral's skill and knowledge, we had reached the Carib Islands as directly as if we had been following a known and familiar course." End quote. Remember this quote. Next time somebody tells you that Columbus was an idiot or a terrible sailor, you remember that. Columbus then sailed from Carib-held island to Carib-held island, finding no Caribs, because it was that time of year when he arrived that the Tainos had told him about, when the Caribs went out marauding Taino islands. But sure enough, he found on the Carib islands of Turuqueira, Seire, and Ayay, Taino women and castrated Taino boys, originally from the island of Buriquen, what is now Puerto Rico, and from other Taino islands, who had been captured and enslaved by the Caribs. They confirmed the accounts that Columbus had heard from other Tainos, that the Caribs had descended on their islands, killed and ate the menfolk, and then kidnapped and enslaved the rest of them. Columbus took aboard his 17-ship fleet every single one of these enslaved Tainos from each Carib island, and shuttled them to Taino-held or other safe islands and set them free. This was Columbus's second Underground Railroad. He first was freeing the Jews. His second and third Underground Railroads were freeing Tainos from enslavement by the Caribs and then by the Hidalgos. And the Caribs weren't just slavers, but genocide heirs. Now, we don't know how many tribes of the Caribbean that they wiped out before the Europeans arrived and Columbus put an end to their campaign of genocide, and that's exactly what he did. He formed an alliance with the Taino chieftain Guacanagari of Hispaniola, what I call the Euro-Taino Alliance, and together their men went in search of the cannibal High King Caonabo of the Caribs, who had murdered all of the Spaniards in the Navidad settlement, the first Spanish settlement, attacked and killed Guacanagari's villagers, kidnapping one of his womenfolk, and threatened to wipe out the settlers of the Isabela settlement as well, the second Spanish settlement. So the Euro-Taino Alliance found Caonabo and his warband, engaged them, and captured the High King, sending him back to Spain to answer for his crimes, along with other prisoners of war, and signing a peace treaty with the less warlike of Caonabo's warriors, many of whom were pressed into service from other tribes. With this successful operation, Christopher Columbus and Chief Guacanagari finally put an end to the Caribs' generations-long campaign of genocide in the West Indies once and for all. Now, a lot of Columbus detractors like to refer to the conclusion of this operation, however, as Columbus transporting slaves back to Spain. Wrong, wrong, wrong. The Carib marauders that Columbus was transporting back to Spain weren't slaves. They were prisoners of war. Columbus was transporting them to Castile to stand trial, not to be enslaved. I don't know how it works in your jurisdiction, in Italy or whatever, but here in Philadelphia, when a criminal is arrested and put in pre-trial detention, it's the sheriff's office who transports that defendant from the pre-trial detention facility to the courthouse to stand trial. Would you say that the sheriff's office is transporting slaves? No reasonable person would say such a thing. So to do so denigrates the true atrocities of slavery and denigrates due process as well, one of the great achievements of Western culture. Well, yeah, many Columbus detractors then say, but Columbus was transporting those prisoners back to Spain to be enslaved. Wrong, wrong. While servitude was a possible sentence for a convicted criminal. There are many other sentences too. So it wasn't a certainty that anyone was going to face enslavement. In fact, it wasn't even a certainty that anyone was even going to face conviction. In fact, we have no record of what became of those Carib marauders who were sent back to Spain to stand trial for the rape, enslavement, and genocide of the other tribes of the Caribbean. The only one whose fate is recorded is High King Caonabo. Not all of the ships that sailed in Columbus's Third Underground Railroad made it back to Spain. The ship Caonabo was on sunk, and he died at sea. So you might call that divine justice. As for Columbus freeing the Taínos from enslavement by the Hidalgos on his Third Underground Railroad, this only made his relationship with the Hidalgos worse, especially considering that it involved him violating the agreement he'd been forced to sign by Roldan. Roldan and the other Hidalgos were furious and would have enacted their revenge, and they did enact their revenge. When Columbus returned to the West Indies on his third voyage, the Hidalgos kept Hispaniola in constant armed revolt against him. He managed to quell no less than 5 Hidalgo revolts. Roldan stole the crown's tribute, tried to assassinate the brother of Columbus and the lieutenant governor, led a military coup to take over Fort Concepcion, sacked the Isabela settlement, plundering its flocks, led a band of mutineers to Jaragua in western Hispaniola, and incited the Carib warlord Guarionex and his marauders to attack the settlement that Columbus had with the settlers. Alonso de Ojeda caused trouble with the tribes in Brazil, proclaiming that he, quote, could do anything he liked to the admiral's prejudice and, quote, excited some not very reliable men with slanderous tales. I mean, he's admitting to his treachery. De las Casas, who is the author of Historia de las Indias, History of the Indies, really the main primary source of pre-Columbian and Columbian history, the settlement of the West Indies. De las Casas blamed Ojeda for the transport of tribal peoples as slaves. He wrote in Book 2, Chapter 61, quote, Ojeda stayed in Santo Domingo for over a year, I believe, and I saw him. Shortly thereafter, it pleased God to end his days, and he died of illness in the city. So poor, he had not a penny for his burial from all his loot and bargaining and slaves. And that was the end of Alonso de Ojeda, who had caused so much damage to the Indians. He was the first to commit injustice on this island by using authority he did not possess. Likewise, he plagued the continent and other islands that had never offended him and captured a great number of Indians whom he sold in Castile as slaves. End quote. So it's Ojeda, not Christopher Columbus, who engaged in the enslavement of the Taino peoples. The next revolt that Columbus quelled, Don Hernando de Guevara and his conspirator, Adrián de Mojica, helped initiate atrocities against the Taínos and sparked yet another Hidalgo rebellion. Columbus actually arrested Mojica for his crimes. Mojica was tried, convicted, and much to Columbus's regret, sentenced to hanging for his crimes. The next revolt, the next Hidalgo revolt that he quelled, Vicente Yáñez Pinzón, brother of the traitorous Captain Alonso Pinzón, or Pinzón, who had gone AWOL with the Pinta on Columbus's first voyage, had, as Columbus wrote to the crown, quote, aroused suspicion and disturbance among the Hidalgos. And last but not least, rebel Hidalgos wrote to Castile condemning the Columbus brothers as, quote, foreigners who had never before been in a position of authority and had no experience of controlling people of quality, end quote, egotistically referring to themselves, the Hidalgos, the Spanish nobles. Columbus wrote his own letters to the crown complaining about the Hidalgos' disobedience and begging the crown to send him someone they would listen to. And on a dark day in history, the monarchs sent Comendador Francisco de Bobadilla, Dark Knight of the Reconquista, himself an Hidalgo. The monarchs told Bobadilla to sort it all out, and if he found that Columbus was the one at fault, to just usurp his office and take over. Well, that was all that Bobadilla needed to hear. Ironically, by the time Bobadilla arrived, Columbus had actually managed to put an end to the rebellions and bring peace to Hispaniola on his own, what I call the Pax Columbiana. But once Bobadilla arrived, there would be no more peace. The first thing Bobadilla did upon making landfall was to put Columbus and his brothers in chains, ally with the Hidalgos, falsify testimonies against Columbus, and send him back to Spain in chains to answer to phony charges of tyrannizing the Hidalgos. As Columbus's prison ship sailed, Bobadilla declared himself Viceroy of the Indies, commandeered the Spanish men-at-arms, and appointed his own conspirators to office, showered them with gold, and then raped and enslaved Taínos, murdering any who resisted. Bobadilla's reign of terror had begun in Columbus's absence. Young Bartolomé de las Casas, future historian and protector of the Indians, bore witness to all of this. He wrote in Book 2, Chapter 1 of History of the Indies, that Bobadilla, quote, would frequently tell them, take as many advantages as you can, since you don't know how long this will last. End quote. The Bobadilla knew Columbus would tell the crown what was really going on, and that's exactly what happened. Even before Columbus reached Spain, he began, with his hands in shackles no less, he refused to let the master of the ship take the shackles off. He said, I'm going to wear these and let the king and queen take them off themselves. With his hands in shackles, he began penning a letter to his friend, Doña Juana de Torres, governess to Prince John, whom Columbus's son Diego served as a page. He recorded in his letter to Doña Juana everything Bobadilla and the Hidalgos had done, though what he knew about Bobadilla's crimes was only the tip of the iceberg, because most of them were committed once he put Columbus on the prison ship. He wrote, quote, a quantity of people who do not deserve baptismal water before God or the world, end quote, were kidnapping women and girls, selling them as sex slaves, and he demanded that the crown put a stop to this. Columbus did. And while Columbus was sailing back to Spain, the Hidalgos acted like monsters. De las Casas wrote, he was there, De las Casas, he wrote in Book 2 of History of the Indies that Bobadilla gave whole tribes to the Hidalgos as slaves, quote, thus making the Hidalgos very happy, end quote. He went on to write, quote, you should have seen those hoodlums, exiled from Castile for homicide, with crimes yet to be accounted for, served by native kings and their vassals doing the meanest chores. These chiefs had daughters, wives, and other close relations whom the Spaniards took for concubines, either with their own consent or by force. The Spaniards loved and adored Bobadilla in exchange for such favors, help, and advice, because they knew how much freer they were now than under Columbus. End quote. De las Casas explains that under Bobadilla's governorship, the Hidalgos became, quote, soulless, blind, and godless, and, quote, perversely abused the Indians, end quote. Once back in Spain, however, Columbus appeared before the crown, told them what Bobadilla had done, and presented his evidence, revealing Bobadilla's treachery. The crown removed his shackles, dismissed all the false charges against him, and deposed Bobadilla from office. With one fell stroke, Christopher Columbus put an end to Bobadilla's reign of slavery and death. But Columbus didn't want to be governor anymore, thanks to the disobedient Hidalgos. So the crown appointed Comendador Mayor Nicolás de Ovando, who ended up being just as bad as, or even worse than, Comendador Bobadilla. And the atrocities against the enslavement of the Taínos, and the enslavement of them continued. Bartolomé de las Casas blamed Ovando for instituting the allocation system in the Caribbean, the allocation of tribal peoples to the Hidalgos as their slaves. He wrote, quote, as the inventor of the allocation system, the Comendador Mayor should have thought about Indian mortality as well as about remedying it. But this was part of his general insensitivity, and he did not notice it, or he simply did not care, end quote. That's from Book 2, Chapter 41. But Columbus petitioned the crown to put an end to it, and he succeeded. He constantly reported to the crown Ovondo's mistreatment of the tribal peoples. In the last years of his life, Columbus successfully petitioned the king to issue the aforementioned royal decree that, quote, all the Indians of Hispaniola were to be left free, not subject to servitude, unmolested and unharmed, and allowed to live like freemen under law just like any other in the kingdom of Castile, end quote. I once told a friend about this decree that Columbus got passed, freeing the tribal peoples of the Americas, and he responded, well, yeah, but then he started the African slave trade. No. Columbus never started any slave trade, much less the African slave trade, which didn't start until 10 years after Columbus was dead. De las Casas tells us in Book 3, Chapter 129 of Historia de las Indias, History of the Indies, that it was Governor Laurent de Gouvernail, or Gauverod, of the Bresse in Burgundy in the French Alps, who granted the first license to some unnamed Spanish settler to transport African slaves circa 1516. Columbus had died in 1506. In fact, though Columbus got that civil rights decree passed just before he died, the Hidalgos ignored it at first because they figured they were so far from Spain and so far from the church and the crown that no one and nothing could stop them. But they didn't count on Bartolomé de las Casas picking up Columbus's baton. In Book 3 of History of the Indies, de las Casas tells how the encomienda and the allocation systems took root in the Caribbean without Columbus. And he talks about how he himself, Bartolomé, stepped up to fill the void in civil rights activism that Columbus's death left. Taking a page from Columbus's playbook, de las Casas too petitioned the widowed King Ferdinand, this time to fund an order of Dominican friars, which de las Casas would lead, whose sole purpose would be to travel around the West Indies, shaming the slave-owning, slave-trading Hidalgos in their sermons, and using their religious clout to exert whatever influence they could. And it worked! Within 10 years, de las Casas' itinerant friars brought the Hidalgos of the West Indies in line with Christopher Columbus's civil rights legislation, and the enslavement and the mistreatment of the tribal peoples of the Americas was ended once and for all. The Spaniards and the tribal peoples intermarried, and the Latino peoples were born. Now, the Columbus detractors, and indeed all detractors of Western culture, like to make much ado about the practice of slavery in the West, calling America inherently flawed and structurally racist and because of it. But what they always neglect to tell you is that every civilization in the history of the earth practiced slavery. The tribal peoples of the West Indies enslaved other tribe members. The tribal peoples of continental North America enslaved Africans and their own kind. The Africans enslaved other Africans and even sold their own people to Portuguese slave traders. The Romans, the Phoenicians, the Huns, the Hans, the Zhuang, the Mongols, the Manchu, all the peoples of Asia, all the peoples of Europe, all the peoples of every civilization from the dawn of man has practiced slavery. In fact, slavery is still practiced today in the Middle East and in communist China and communist North Korea. But Western culture, specifically Christians, put an end to slavery. Christopher Columbus was our first abolitionist. So once again, when the lying Marxist Columbus detractors accuse Columbus of being a slave owner or a slave trader, they're not just telling you an untruth. They're telling you that most pernicious type of lie, the opposite of what is true. And that's it for today's video. I'm going to have to talk about the accusations of him being a poor administrator in the next video. All right, thanks. There you go.